July 1st, 1917, Beijing, Republic of China. As chaos grips the country, the discussion in the Beiyang government comes to World War I. Some say to join, thinking it can increase China's reputation and allow them to regain territories held by foreign powers. Others say they need to get the warlords under their control first. So, they invited Zhang Jun to mediate and find a solution to the mess. But things would not go that smoothly. When he arrived, Zhang announced the restoration of the Qing monarchy and restored the child emperor Puyi to the throne. Suddenly, the republic was thrown into chaos again. Meanwhile, Sun Yat-sen and his men prepared to take back China. Who would win was still undecided. This is the Chinese Revolution, Episode 5. In the last episode, we talked about how China ended up falling from a blooming democracy to an empire and finally split up. With Yan dead, there is a power vacuum. Before Li Yanhong, a prominent general, could save the government, Yan's generals took charge of what was left of the army and took provinces. Where they were upon the end of the war was where they stayed and where they controlled. They were already stationed in provinces during the war and now exercised full control over them. But with Yan dead, they were now in command. Before we can talk about the Manchu Restoration, however, we need to talk about warlords and what they were. Because if I just throw out random Chinese words without explaining who they are, you'll just get confused. This is a map of the military cliques of China, and, as you see, they're just the names of the general who commands them, mostly. The exceptions are the Zhili clique that controlled Beijing, which was the most sought-after place in the country. The Anhui clique controlled the largest swath of land, and was also split up among multiple exclaves. And the Fengtian clique, which would briefly control Beijing and eventually control the entirety of Manchuria, with the rest of the warlords varying. Jin, who controlled Shanxi, was actually a good leader. He wanted reform and to keep his homeland out of the fighting, and life drastically improved under him, but most other warlords just used the civilian population as part of their army. You'll hear a lot about them later, and I'm sorry if I can't get to cover all the warlords and cliques, but I'll try to mention most of them. But this period of history is quite messy. What you need to know is, for now, the Zhili clique controlled Beijing and was not yet fighting the Anhui clique, but they were debating whether to join World War I to gain territory, so they invited Zhang Jun. Then things went down. On the morning of July 1st, 1917, Zhang arrived in Beijing, and he immediately proclaimed himself Prime Minister of the Imperial Cabinet and Puyi as Emperor of China again. He was supported by others who used to work for the Qing. Over the next 48 hours, Beijing descended into chaos, with supporters cheering at the Temple of Heaven, and Zhang falsifying the signature of Li Yanhong in order to legitimize his rule. The Zhili clique then took up positions at the outskirts of Beijing. President Li ended up fleeing with military escorts to the French embassy before he appointed Feng Zhoushan as president and Dan Querry as premier. Dan then got to work preparing a force to retake the city, as well as founding the Republic of China Air Force, but I'm sure that will never catch on. On July 5th, 1917, his troops seized the Beijing-Tianjin Railway 40 kilometers from the capital, cutting off supply from the sea. The Qing court, which I mentioned had been operating since the Xinhai Revolution, had accepted the movement and accepted laws that would enshrine control over Beijing. The Fengtian army joined in and helped push into Beijing. Dan then ordered one of the planes he had to drop bombs on the Forbidden City and take out the Emperor. A Quadron Type D plane then ended up dropping 3 bombs, causing the death of one staff worker, but otherwise minor damage. This was the first bombing casualty for the Republic of China Air Force. On the 9th of July, they prepared to push in. The combined Fiang Tian and Zhili Klieg encountered fierce fighting in Beijing. The imperial court wrote a decree of abdication but did not issue it due to fear of Zheng's forces. The Republican forces announced a full assault on the Forbidden City on the 12th. As soon as fighting began, they surrendered. Hen Pui abdicated for the second time in his life. Zhang fled to the legations, and the Zhili Klieg took control. With that, Li Yanhong did not return to the presidency. So the main man who opposed joining World War I was gone. After a ship full of Chinese laborers sank in 1917, the Republic of China declared war on Germany on August 14th. China sent a large amount of workers to Europe. Some worked in making ammo in factories. Others worked in the front lines, carrying troops and moving equipment. They were sent to Weihai Wei and shipped to Europe. Weihai Wei being another colony that Britain operated in Shandong. In the USS Monoke incident in 1918, Chinese peasants ended up attacking a gunboat along the Yangtze River. The incident left one American dead. An apology was issued by the Chinese government after protests broke out in Shanghai, and $25,000 in reparations was paid to the United States. It was one of multiple instances involving armed Chinese firing on foreign vessels. No combat troops were ever sent to the Western Front, but 2,300 troops moved in and occupied Vladivostok during China's little-known participation in the Russian Civil War. But, through all this time, what happened to Sun Yat-sen? He moved his base to Guangzhou, where he was popular, and convened several southern Chinese warlords who agreed to join him. He convened a national congress on September 1917, and out of the 91 delegates, 87 voted to make him president again. He presented his vision for the future of this new government. He thought it was a bad idea to expect the Chinese people to suddenly just change to democracy. He thought the Kuomintang, which was the rival party of the Beiyang government, was to adhere to strict loyalty to the party, and that after the Chinese people were taught democracy for a few years, they would gradually shift to one. Ironically enough, this is literally what happened in Taiwan many years later. He took office in December 1917 and appointed his picks for several government roles, denouncing Dan Querry and vowed to follow the Northern Expedition. Soon, however, the Joint Conference of All Provinces to Protect the Law was formed, with Chen Zhishan as the chief representative of the meeting, advocating for recognition of the Beiyang government's legal system and formation of a coalition government to seek compromise with the Beiyang warlords. The government passed laws friendly to the Beiyang government, which were opposed by Sun, but nevertheless, things were working, and planning for the Northern Expedition began in 1918. However, it was not to be. On May 4th, 1918, Sun angrily resigned to the Extraordinary Congress and energized him to expose the crime of the Southwestern warlords' sabotage of the Constitutional Protection Movement. Frustrated with their ineffectiveness and selling out to the Beiyang government through reorganization, on the 20th of May, the general marshal system was abolished and the generals were replaced by 7 presidents. Sun fled to Shanghai with his new wife and wrote, but he did not stop there. Shanghai was friendly to him, and Sun looked for troops. He ended up relying on people who controlled Shanghai, the criminal triads. Shanghai was basically an anarchic state, but thanks to the foreign legations, it managed to become the most westernized city in China at the time. One of these triads, who would end up joining the Kuomintang at the time, was an insignificant figure, I'm sure he won't ever come up again in history, named Chiang Kai-shek. Sun would end up rotating between Shanghai and Guangzhou for a long time. But then the Treaty of Versailles happened, and it was bad. China, for being on the winning side, ended up losing territory, not getting Qingdao, and barely getting anything. This led to the May 4th movement, in which students gathered to stop the delegates from signing the treaty. Thousands of students, mostly organized by a fringe group called the Communist Party of China, gathered in Tiananmen Square. The protests were successful, and China became the only allied nation not to sign the Treaty of Versailles. One of the students protesting was a man who I'm sure will never do anything in history and will never be mentioned again, a librarian named Mao Zedong. Sun continued to write in Shanghai, talking about infrastructure plans to lay down 100,000 kilometers of new railway, dam the Yangtze, and construct new ports across the country. Ironically enough, this would eventually happen, but only in the last 30 years. He yelled at the hypocrisy of nations like the US, who said they supported freedom but backed warlords that were friendly to their cause. Sounds familiar? This made Sun popular with the growing group of young intellectuals. That, and his willingness to cooperate with the Communist Party to defeat the warlords, made him very popular among a new generation of Chinese. In 1920, the government in Guangzhou was falling into infighting, and Sun returned in November. The Congress then passed a law to abolish the military government and establish the government of the Republic of China in Guangzhou. Sun took office for a third time in April 1921. The beautiful flag was now replaced with this good but still nice flag, I guess, not as good as the old one. The Second Constitutional Protection Movement had officially begun. After Sun Yat-sen took office, the Northern Expedition was opposed by Chen Jiaoming, who had risen to prominence in Guangzhou through the development of the Guangdong Army. Chen Jiaoming advocated for joint provincial autonomy, but Sun stated that would recognize the status quo of the Beiyang government. But meanwhile, another conflict was brewing, the Zhili Clique and the Anhui Clique. The Anhui wanted to use a military solution to solve the issue of the southern warlords. Dan Quiri then raised a de facto army and occupied Outer Mongolia. The Fang Tian Clique then allied with the Zhili and began talks with southern provinces. By April 1920, the governors of Hebei, Henan, Liaoning, Jilin, Heilongjiang, Jiangsu, Jiangxi, and Jiangxi joined the anti-Anhui alliance. They all publicly denounced the Anhui Clique, and Anhui gathered 5 divisions for the National Stabilization Army, as they called it, and the Anhui people then gathered. On July 14, 1920, the Anhui army attacked the Zhili army on both fronts that they bordered. Zhili troops were forced to abandon their posts and retreat to the second line of defense. There, the Anhui offensive was stopped. The Zhili gathered a counterattack and pursued the retreating enemy toward Beijing. With the exception of the 15th Division, the remainder of the Anhui army on the Western Front was annihilated. On the same day, the Fangtian army attacked the Anhui Eastern Front. Upon learning of the collapse of the Western Zone, Anhui commanders fled to Beijing. On July 19, 1920, Dan Quiri realized that the fight was over and resigned from his post. On July 23rd, the combined Fangtian and Zhili cliques entered Nannui, and the Anhui clique was no more. And the Fangtian and Zhili clique were now able to form a joint government, one that would last 2 years. In Guangzhou, just as Sun Yat-sen set up the next united government, Chen Jiaming began talks with the northern warlords, promising his government would be more receptive to the Beiyang. Forces in the Beiyang government announced that the North and South governments would be overthrown and a new united government formed. The Fangtians were not happy about this and began massing troops. In April 1922, after Parliament diverted funds to the Zhili army, the Fangtians attacked the HQ in Tianjin, and the first offensive by the Fangtians occurred. This was short-lived, as units defected and began to join the Zhili. The Fangtian's second echelon under the command of Zhen Zhuiling was the cream of the Fangtian army and became the main target of the Zhili attack. Having achieved complete victory in the west, Wu Peifu redeployed his crack troops and personally repulsed the enemy's attacks with minor casualties. They were eventually forced to lead an organized retreat, abandoning ground. A settlement was achieved, and eventually the British got involved. The two sides met on a British warship in Weihaiwei and agreed that Shandong would go to the Fangtians and the border would be pushed back to Manchuria. The Zhili would control Beijing until the next war. During the war, leaders declared martial law in Guangzhou. Wu Beifu and Chen Jiaming used Li Handong's reinstatement as an excuse to claim that the purpose of protecting the constitution had been achieved, and they demanded that Sun Yat-sen and Zhu Sheshang step down simultaneously. Since Sun Yat-sen once issued a political declaration during a war to defend the law, he promised if the Beiyang veteran Zhu Sheshang and his Beiyang government step down and disband, he will also step down. They said no. Chen took the final step and began plotting in the middle of the night to overthrow Sun. On the same day, Li Ju mobilized his troops on Baiyun Mountain to prepare for the bombardment of the presidential palace and the Yuji Tower. On the 16th of June, the Cantonese military first called and notified the bombardment of the presidential palace. Sun escaped on the ship Yongfang and went back to Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek joined him the next day. The Second Constitutional Protection Movement had failed, and Sun was back to writing in Shanghai. Sun and his escorts made it to Shanghai. Li Yongzhang, a friendly warlord, was popular, and Sun was once again irrelevant. Gongzhou was now under the Beiyang government control. Sun began an active policy of cooperation with the Communist Party. This helped gain more members, and some Chinese communists even joined the Kuomintang. The Soviets were now getting interested in China, and the Soviet Union's Adolf Joffe met with Sun in early January 1923 to sign the Sun-Joffe Pact, which asserted the Soviet system was not right for China, and the Soviets would help in reunifying China. He was endorsed by Vladimir Lenin, who praised Sun's fight against imperialism and for social reform. Meanwhile, after the success of the First Zhili-Anhui War, the Zhili Clique wanted to restore Li Hanhong as president, which I mentioned earlier, thus restoring lots of their legitimacy. However, his second presidency was even more powerless than the first. As soon as Li returned, he was faced with rivals and National Assembly picked by Wu Beifu. General Cao Kun also wanted to become prime minister, and was restrained from that for now. President Li tried to create a, quote, able-bodied cabinet consisting of experts, but he ruined it by arresting the finance minister on suspicious rumors supplied by the speakers of parliament. The cabinet resigned en masse, and Wu was no longer able to shield Li from all of the backlash. A new cabinet tried to impeach Li Yanhong and instate Cao Kun as president. Cao then spent the next 3 months promoting his presidency and offering $5,000 to anyone who would vote for him, which is literally just corruption, but no one cared. He received condemnation from all sides, but he was successful, and was inaugurated on the anniversary of the Wuchang Uprising in 1923, using a new constitution, only made official until 1947. Then, yet another shock. Sun Yat-sen was back in Guangzhou. Friendly warlords joined forces with Yan to overthrow Chen Jiaming. He resigned before this could happen, and Sun returned to Guangzhou, where he established the army and navy stronghold of the Republic of China. Planning for a third northern expedition began, along with the help of the Soviets. Everything was falling into place. He had everything he needed for the expedition. In late 1924, he established the Whampoa Military Academy, the current military academy of Taiwan. He assigned Chiang Kai-shek as its commandant, and established the National Revolutionary Army. However, this was not the official army of China. This was the military of the Kuomintang Party. In September 1924, Jiangsu warlord Qi Zhiyang demanded control of Shanghai from the last remnants of the Anhui Clique. Fighting broke out between the provinces. Due to this, the Fangtian saw weakness in the Zhili. The Second Zhili-Fangtian War interrupted as tensions between the Zhili and Fangtian cliques soared. Honestly, this deserves its own video, and I could make this much longer and go into the most detail I could, but I'm just giving you the most important notes for this. After years of tensions and alliances and shifting loyalties, the Fangtian clique, led by Zhang Zhaolin, sought to assert its dominance over the Zhili-controlled Beijing, capitalizing on the latter's weakened position following the chaotic aftermath of the Qing Restoration and their previous war. The conflict ignited with skirmishes along the borders of their territories, swiftly escalating into a full-scale war as both factions deployed their armies and gathered support from various local warlords. The indecisiveness of the Zhili leadership and the unifying force of the Fangtian ambition turned the battlefield into a brutal contest of wills, leading to widespread devastation across northern China. As the Zhili slowly got pushed back, on October 23, 1924, Fang Yuxian's Beijing defense troops, which were controlled by the Zhili Clique, seized control of key government buildings, public utilities, and the roads leading in and out of Beijing. Cao Kun was placed under house arrest and stripped of his presidency. Upon receiving the news, General Wu Beifu pulled back his forces to rescue Beijing, leaving only 4,000 men on his front. Seeing this, the Zhili forces pushed to pursue him and break the front lines. They surrounded Beijing, and Dan Querry ordered Wu Beifu to leave on boat via Tianjin. The war was effectively over by March, with all of the Zhili Clique's north being lost. And that's when the Japanese began to get involved with the Fangtian Clique, but we'll get into that next episode. Just after, Sun Yat-sen visited Hong Kong. He gave a speech to the students, saying how Hong Kong's sophisticated culture and democracy made him a revolutionary. That same year, he delivered a speech in which he presented his 3 principles of the people. Minzu, or nationalism, describes a nation rather than a group of people united by a purpose. Minquan, or democracy, is what it is. People deserve rights and a choice of governance. Minxiang, or land reform, talks about land rights and heavily endorses Georgism. He also presented the 5 Yuan Constitution, the current constitution of Taiwan that was not adopted until 1947. This speech was later adapted with music behind it to become the national anthem of the Republic of China, still used today in Taiwan. On November 10, 1924, he traveled to Tianjin to give a speech advocating for the abolition of all unequal treaties, which were treaties made with the Western powers that made China weak. He then traveled to Beijing to meet with Fangtian leadership. Along the way, Sun got sick and was exhausted. He spoke to Muslim warlord Ma Fushang, who said he would welcome Sun's leadership and advocated for the Northern Expedition. After he traveled to Japan to give a speech in Kobe on Pan-Asianism, an ideology saying that all Asian nations should unite in the fight against Western powers. However, when he arrived back in Beijing to talk to more warlords, his condition got worse. He was admitted to Peking Union Hospital, where he was diagnosed with sarcoma in his liver. He had 10 days left to live. He was treated with radium and survived the 10 days. However, against the advice of his doctors, he was moved to the Kuomintang headquarters in Shanghai. He was treated with traditional Chinese medicine, but that didn't help. Sun Yat-sen died on March 12, 1925, surrounded by friends and his wife, Sun Qingling. His body was preserved at Peking Union Hospital, where its preservation was guaranteed for 150 years. It was kept in Beijing until 1929, when a large mausoleum was built and a proper funeral was held for the late revolutionary. He was kept forever there, and remains of his body were covered in concrete where they can be seen today. Today, the mausoleum was kept up by communist authorities, and you can still see the Taiwanese and Kuomintang flag flying in the mausoleum. But his legacy did not live there. He became an icon to China, and many people with different goals all looked up to him. Communists, warlord, the KMT, independence fighters, and even the Japanese, all unified under the memory of one man, the man with a dream of China, Sun Yat-sen.